The assignment board told Jessica Martinez everything she needed to know about her place in the pecking order. Her name had been there since Monday morning, printed in clean block letters under deployment prep. Jessica Martinez, Coastal. Insertion Specialist, Unit Ready. She'd walked past it every day for a week, watching other names come and go as missions launched and returned. Today, standing in the pre-dawn darkness of the operations building, she saw the brutal red line scratched through her name like a wound that wouldn't heal. Below it, written in smaller letters that seemed almost apologetic, was her new assignment: Logistics Support. The stroke was hard enough to tear the laminate backing. No initials marked who had made the change, just the cold absence where her mission slot used to be. Jessica adjusted her equipment belt and stared at the board for another moment, her jaw tight but her expression unchanged. She'd learned long ago that showing emotion in this place was like showing weakness to sharks. Commander Robert Miles emerged from the briefing room with his usual swagger, coffee cup in one hand and mission folder in the other. His khaki uniform was pressed to perfection, every ribbon and medal catching the harsh fluorescent light. He paused when he saw Jessica standing by the board, his lips pulling into what might have been a smile if it had reached his eyes. "Martinez," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone officers used when they wanted to sound reasonable while being anything but. "I see you found the updated assignments. Hope there's no confusion about your role today." Jessica turned slowly, her dark eyes meeting his without blinking. "No confusion, sir. Just wondering why my name was moved when the coastal conditions haven't changed since my last report." Miles took a sip of his coffee, making her wait for his response. It was a power play she'd seen him use countless times, the strategic pause that reminded everyone who held rank in this room. "The thing about coastal conditions, Martinez, is that they've been the same for longer than you've been wearing that uniform. Razor 6 has run operations in that sector before. They'll run them again. Sir, the satellite imagery from 3 days ago shows significant erosion at the southern inlet. The entry point that was marked at 30 meters is now down to 20, maybe less. The cross-current. Are you questioning the mission parameters?" Miles interrupted, his voice dropping to a lower register that every sailor in the building would recognize as dangerous territory. Jessica felt the familiar weight of eyes turning toward their conversation. Other personnel in the operations center had slowed their morning routines, coffee cups pausing halfway to lips, keyboards falling silent. This was the kind of moment that got whispered about later in the enlisted mess, the kind of confrontation that could define careers. "No, sir," she said carefully. "I'm providing updated intelligence on changing conditions." "Intelligence, that's already been reviewed and incorporated into the mission planning." Miles stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "You know what I appreciate about you, Martinez? You're thorough. Sometimes too thorough. But that's what makes you valuable in logistics support. The paperwork needs someone with your attention to detail." The dismissal was surgical in its precision. Not harsh enough to constitute a reprimand, not public enough to be called humiliation, but devastating in its casual cruelty. Jessica nodded. Once, her face a mask of professional composure, even as something cold and hard settled in her chest. "Understood, sir." Miles patted her shoulder with false familiarity before walking away, already turning his attention to the cluster of SEALs gathered near the equipment lockers. Razor 6 stood in their tight circle, checking gear and running through final preparations with the easy confidence of men who'd never been told they weren't needed. Jessica remained by the assignment board for another moment, her eyes tracing the red line through her name one more time. Then she turned and walked toward the hovercraft bay, her boots echoing in the empty corridor. Behind her, she could hear Miles beginning the mission briefing, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd never had to question whether he belonged in the room. The bay was quiet except for the distant hum of ventilation systems and soft lapping of waves against the seawall outside. 3 hovercrafts sat in their designated spots, 2 marked with mission tags and crew assignments, 1 sitting in the shadows like a forgotten afterthought. Jessica's craft waited in the furthest berth, its hull clean and maintained but bearing no deployment markings. She pulled on her work gloves and ran her hands along the craft's hull, checking for damage or wear. The metal was cold under her, palms but familiar, every dent and scratch telling the story of missions she'd flown and obstacles she'd overcome. This hovercraft had never failed her, never left her stranded, never questioned whether she deserved to be behind its controls. Inside the cramped cockpit, everything was exactly as she'd left it. Her charts were folded and secured in their designated slots, her emergency equipment checked and rechecked, her personal thermos sitting in its holder still warm from the coffee she'd poured before dawn. This was her space, the one place on the entire base where her competence couldn't be questioned or her value diminished. She settled into the pilot's seat and closed her eyes, letting the familiar sounds and smells wash over her. Somewhere across the base, Razor 6 was loading out for a mission she should have been leading. Somewhere in the operations center, men who'd never set foot in a hovercraft were making decisions about tides and currents they'd never personally measured. Jessica opened her eyes and reached for her tide charts, spreading them across her lap with practiced efficiency. The red mark she'd made 3 days ago told the story Miles didn't want to hear. Water levels dropping, current speeds increasing, a natural choke point forming exactly where Razor 6 planned to make their insertion. She traced the coastline, with her finger following the inlet's curve to where it narrowed dangerously. Her calculations were precise, her measurements verified through multiple observations. The window for safe passage was closing faster than anyone in the command structure wanted to acknowledge. Outside, she could hear the distant sound of engines, starting up as the official mission prepared to launch. Jessica folded her charts and secured them back in their slots. Whether or not anyone wanted her expertise, she would be ready. She'd learned long ago that being prepared was the only defense against a world that seemed determined to keep her on the sidelines. The hovercraft hummed quietly around her, patient as a loyal dog waiting for a command that might never come. Jessica checked her watch, calculated the tides, and settled into wait. Sometimes the most important missions were the ones nobody asked you to fly. The fog rolled in just after midnight, thick and cold off the Pacific, turning the base into a maze of half-seen shapes and muffled sounds. Jessica had been awake since 3 in the morning, same as every day before a coastal deployment. While the rest of the base slept, she'd made her way through the darkness to the tide pools beyond the security fence, her waterproof notebook clutched against her chest and her measuring equipment slung over her shoulder. The water was frigid, biting through her wetsuit as she waded knee-deep into the surf. This was the part of her job that nobody saw, the unglamorous data collection that happened in the pre-dawn hours when the base was quiet and the tides were right. She pressed her depth gauge into the sand, watching the digital readout fluctuate as waves pushed and pulled around her legs. 22 meters at the inlet mouth. 2 meters narrower than yesterday's measurement, 4 meters narrower than the official charts still hanging in the operations center. Jessica made careful notes in her waterproof pad, her handwriting steady despite the cold that made her fingers stiff inside her gloves. The crosscurrent was stronger too, pulling with a force that made her adjust her stance to keep from being swept sideways. She could feel the water's urgency, the way it funneled through the narrowing gap with increasing velocity. Physics was unforgiving. The same volume of water forced through a smaller opening meant faster speeds, more turbulence, more danger for any craft trying to navigate the passage. Back at the base, she downloaded her measurements into her personal laptop, cross-referencing them against tide tables and weather patterns. The story they told was clear and troubling. The inlet was deteriorating faster than predicted, turning what had been a challenging but manageable insertion point into a potential death trap. She printed out updated charts and clipped them to her field report, the same report she'd tried to present during yesterday's mission briefing. The same report Commander Miles had dismissed with a wave of his hand and a comment about the coastline being older than her career. In the hovercraft bay, her craft sat in its shadowed corner like a piece of forgotten equipment. No mission tags adorned its hull, no crew assignments were posted nearby. But Jessica had been maintaining it with the same meticulous care she applied to her data collection. Every system had been checked and double-checked, every component serviced and tested. She climbed into the cockpit and began her pre-flight routine, muscle memory guiding her hands through the familiar sequence. Fuel levels, hydraulic pressure, communications equipment, navigation systems, everything was green across the board. The craft was ready for a mission it would never be assigned. "Working late again, Martinez?" The voice startled her, and she looked up to see Petty Officer First Class David Kim standing at the base of her hovercraft. Kim was one of the few people on base who treated her like a professional rather than an inconvenience. He'd been a helicopter mechanic before cross-training to work on the hovercraft, and he understood the importance of preparation that happened outside official channels. "Just running diagnostics," Jessica replied, climbing down from the cockpit. "Can't hurt to be ready." Kim nodded, his expression serious. "Heard you got bumped from the Razor 6 deployment." "That's rough." Jessica shrugged, trying to project indifference she didn't feel. "Logistics support is important too." "Cut the diplomatic crap," Kim said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "I've seen your work. I've seen your charts. If I was running a coastal insertion, I'd want you on point, not warming a bench in the operations center." The validation felt like water in a desert, but Jessica kept her expression neutral. "Miles has his reasons. Miles has his prejudices," Kim said bluntly. "He's got this old-school mentality where women belong in support roles and men do the real fighting. Never mind that you've got more time in those craft than half of Razor 6 combined." Jessica felt a flicker of something dangerous. Hope? Maybe, or recognition that she wasn't completely alone in her assessment of the situation. But hope was a luxury she couldn't afford, not in this environment where showing vulnerability was career suicide. "I appreciate the support, Kim, but complaining won't change anything. I'll do my job, whatever job they assign me." Kim studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Fair enough. But for what it's worth, if something goes sideways out there, I hope they have the sense to ask for help from someone who actually knows what they're talking about." After Kim left, Jessica remained in the bay, staring at her hovercraft in the dim light. The craft's hull gleamed dully under the overhead. Fluorescence, every line and curve familiar to her after countless hours of operation. This wasn't just a machine to her. It was an extension of her will, a tool that had never let her down when everything else in her career seemed to be conspiring against her. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through the weather updates, cross-referencing them with her tide calculations. The window for safe passage through the inlet was closing rapidly. By tomorrow morning, when Razor 6 was scheduled to launch, the conditions would be marginal at best. By afternoon, they'd be outright dangerous. Part of her wanted to try again, to print out new charts and march into Miles's office with updated projections and strongly worded recommendations. But she'd learned through bitter experience that pushing too hard only made commanders dig in deeper, made them more determined to prove they were right, and she was just an overly cautious female, trying to tell seasoned warriors how to do their jobs. Instead, she climbed back into her hovercraft and continued her preparations. She checked the emergency medical kit, verified the communications equipment, tested the backup navigation systems. If when something went wrong, she would be ready to respond. Not because anyone had asked her to be, not because it was her official assignment, but because it was the right thing to do. The fog pressed against the bay's windows, turning the outside world into a gray void. Somewhere out there, dangerous currents were reshaping the coastline hour by hour, creating hazards that wouldn't appear on any official chart until it was too late. Jessica had tried to warn them through proper channels, had followed protocol, and filed reports and made presentations that fell on deaf ears. Now she would prepare for the inevitable in the only way she knew how, quietly, professionally, and alone. The morning briefing felt like theater, all performance and no substance. Jessica sat in the back row of the operations center, her updated charts folded in her lap like a secret she'd never be allowed to share. Commander Miles stood at the front of the room, his laser pointer dancing across satellite images that were 3 days out of date, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who'd never been wrong about anything that mattered. Insertion point. Bravo remains optimal for this operation, Miles announced, clicking to the next slide. Current velocity is within acceptable parameters. Water depth adequate for hovercraft operations. Weather window extends through 1400 hours local time. Jessica's jaw tightened as she stared at the images on screen. The satellite photos showed the inlet as it had been nearly a week ago, before the storm surge and tidal shifts. That had fundamentally altered the underwater topography. She had measurements proving the passage had narrowed by over 30%, data showing current speeds that exceeded safe operational limits. Razor 6 sat in the front row, their attention focused on Miles with the casual confidence of men who'd never had reason to doubt their commanders. Team leader Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb nodded along as Miles outlined the mission timeline, his weathered face showing no concern about conditions he'd never personally verified. "Sir," Jessica said, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of the briefing room. The room fell silent. Every head turned toward her, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed irritation. Miles lowered his laser pointer and fixed her with a stare that could have frozen seawater. "Yes, Martinez? I have updated measurements from this morning's reconnaissance. The inlet conditions have changed significantly since these photos were taken." Miles's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "I wasn't aware logistics personnel were conducting unauthorized reconnaissance missions." The words hit like a slap, designed to humiliate her in front of the entire room. Jessica felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice steady. "I conducted measurements within my area of responsibility as coastal insertion specialist." "Your area of responsibility," Miles said slowly, "is logistics support. Unless I'm mistaken about your current assignment." Murmurs rippled through the assembled personnel. Jessica could feel the weight of judgment settling over her like a shroud. This was exactly the kind of insubordination that ended careers, the kind of public challenge to authority the commanders never forgot or forgave. But people were going to die if she stayed silent. "Sir, the inlet mouth has narrowed to less than 20 meters. Current velocity is approaching 15 knots through the gap. These conditions exceed safe operational parameters for hovercraft insertion." Miles set his coffee cup down with deliberate care, the ceramic clicking against the metal table like a judge's gavel. "Are you suggesting that I cancel a mission based on the unauthorized observations of someone who isn't even assigned to this operation?" "I'm suggesting that we verify current conditions before committing personnel to a potentially dangerous insertion." The silence stretched like a wire under tension. Jessica could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the stares of everyone in the room boring into her. Some faces showed sympathy, others showed discomfort at witnessing her professional suicide. Miles let the moment hang, savoring her public humiliation. "Martinez," he said finally, his voice carrying the tone of a parent addressing a particularly stubborn child. "I appreciate your dedication to safety. I really do. But second-guessing mission parameters based on personal opinions isn't helpful to anyone. The professionals who planned this operation have taken all relevant factors into account. These aren't opinions, sir. They're measurements." Miles's smile was thin and sharp as a blade. Measurements taken by someone who apparently has difficulty understanding her current job description. "Let me clarify something for you, Martinez. Your job is to support this mission from the operations center. Your job is not to play amateur meteorologist or to question decisions made by people with significantly more experience than you possess." The dismissal was surgical in its cruelty. Not harsh enough to constitute a formal reprimand, but devastating in its public nature. Jessica felt something break inside her chest. Not her resolve, but her last remaining faith in the system she'd devoted her career to serving. "Understood, sir." She stood and walked toward the door, her spine straight and her face composed despite the wreckage of her professional reputation scattered behind her. As she reached the exit, she heard Miles resuming his briefing, his voice carrying renewed authority now that the challenge to his competence had been publicly crushed. "As I was saying, Insertion Point Bravo offers optimal conditions for this operation." Jessica stepped into the corridor and closed the door behind her, shutting out the voices of men who would soon be flying toward conditions they refused to acknowledge. The hallway stretched before her, empty and silent except for the distant hum of ventilation systems and the soft sound of her boots on polished concrete. She'd tried to do it the right way. She'd followed protocol, submitted reports, made presentations, and raised concerns through proper channels. Every attempt had been dismissed, every warning ignored, every piece of evidence brushed aside by men who seemed to believe that acknowledging her expertise would somehow diminish their own authority. Now she was faced with a choice that would define not just her career, but her conscience. She could accept her role as a marginalized support person, filing papers and updating databases while better qualified personnel flew into danger. Or she could prepare for the inevitable moment when their arrogance met reality's unforgiving physics. Jessica walked toward the hovercraft bay, her mind already shifting from what she couldn't control to what she could. Her craft waited in its shadowed corner, maintained and ready despite having no official mission assignment. Her charts were current, her measurements precise, her equipment tested and functional. She couldn't save them from their own prejudice and pride, but she could be ready when their mistakes came home to roost. Sometimes the most important missions were the ones nobody authorized, the ones launched not because you were ordered to, but because you couldn't live with the alternative. The fog was getting thicker outside, turning the base into a maze of half-seen shapes and muffled sounds. Jessica pulled on her gloves and began her final preparations. If Razor 6 wanted to fly blind into danger, that was their choice. But when they needed rescue from the consequences of their commander's ego, she would be there, ready or not. The secure communications array picked up the first distress signal at 0230 hours, a broken transmission that cut through the static like a scream in the dark. Jessica had been monitoring multiple frequencies from her position in the operations center, her fingers dancing across the radio controls while officially updating logistics databases that nobody would read until morning. Mayday. Mayday ... This is Razor 6. Taking heavy fire. 2 down. Repeat. 2 down. The transmission dissolved into static and electromagnetic noise, leaving behind a silence that felt like a held breath. Around the operations center, night shift personnel looked up from their screens and coffee cups, suddenly alert to the possibility that routine had just become crisis. Commander Miles emerged from his office, looking like a man who'd been awakened from deep sleep his uniform rumpled and his hair showing the impression of a pillow. He moved to the communications console with the careful precision of someone trying to project alertness while fighting off fatigue. "Get me a clear channel." "To Razor 6, he ordered the communications specialist. "I need their status and location." "Static," answered him. The specialist tried multiple frequencies, adjusting settings and boosting signal strength, but the ocean gave back only electronic silence. Whatever had happened to Razor 6, they were now beyond the reach of normal communications. Jessica remained at her workstation, officially focused on supply inventories while actually calculating distances and fuel consumption rates. If Razor 6 had reached their planned insertion point before running into trouble, they were approximately 40 nautical miles northwest of the base, operating in the exact conditions she'd warned about during the morning briefing. "Sir," the communications specialist said, his voice tight with controlled urgency, "I'm not getting any response from Razor 6 on any frequency. Either their communications are down or—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room understood the implications of radio silence from a team that should have been maintaining regular contact with base operations. Miles stood over the radio console, his hands gripping the edge of the metal housing hard enough to whiten his knuckles. "Keep trying. Rotate through all emergency frequencies. I want contact with that team." Jessica watched the commander's face, noting the way his jaw worked as he processed possibilities he didn't want to consider. Miles was many things: arrogant, prejudiced, dangerously overconfident, but he wasn't entirely heartless. The men of Razor 6 were his responsibility, and their silence was becoming a weight that would define his career one way or another. "What about drone reconnaissance?" suggested the duty officer, a young lieutenant whose voice cracked slightly under the pressure of speaking up during a crisis. "We could get eyes on their last known position." Miles shook his head. "Weather's too thick for drone operations. Visibility is down to less than 50 meters, and the wind conditions would make it impossible to maintain stable flight." Jessica knew he was right about the weather, but she also knew there were alternatives he wasn't considering. A hovercraft could operate in conditions that grounded conventional aircraft, could navigate by instruments and experience when optical recognition failed. She'd done it before, during training exercises that had seemed academic at the time, but now felt like preparation for this exact moment. The radio crackled again, another broken transmission fighting through atmospheric interference and electronic noise. ... Need immediate extraction. Inlet compromised. Cannot reach. Then silence again, more profound and ominous than before. Miles grabbed the microphone himself, keying the transmit button with enough force to risk breaking the equipment. "Razor 6, this is base operations. Confirm your status and location. We are standing by to assist." Nothing. The static seemed to mock his authority, his assumption that problems could be solved through proper channels and clear communication. Jessica almost felt sorry for him, almost, but not quite. She opened her laptop and began pulling up tidal charts and weather data, cross-referencing current conditions against the mission timeline Razor 6 had been following. The mathematics were brutal in their clarity. The team had hit the inlet at almost precisely the worst possible moment, when tidal flows were at their peak velocity, and the narrowed passage would have been churning like a washing machine full of broken glass. Her fingers moved across the keyboard, calculating distances and travel times, fuel consumption rates, and mission duration windows. If Razor 6 was in trouble at the inlet, traditional extraction methods would be useless. The water was too rough for boats, the weather too severe for helicopters, the terrain too treacherous for ground-based rescue. But a hovercraft could make the run. A hovercraft piloted by someone who understood the conditions, who had current charts and recent measurements, who knew exactly what they were flying into, because they'd been studying it for weeks while everyone else dismissed their warnings as excessive caution. Jessica saved her calculations to an encrypted file and backed up her data to multiple locations. She updated her personal equipment roster, verified the status of her emergency medical supplies, and sent a routine maintenance report that buried her actual preparations in bureaucratic camouflage. Around her, the operations center had taken on the controlled urgency of a military unit facing crisis. Personnel moved with purpose between workstations. Radio operators rotated through frequencies in systematic search patterns, and duty officers consulted operational manuals for procedures they hoped they'd never need to implement. Miles stood at the center of it all, projecting authority while privately wrestling with decisions that would define his legacy. Jessica could see the calculation in his eyes, the careful weighing of risks against potential outcomes. He could launch a rescue mission with inadequate intelligence and risk losing more personnel, or he could wait for conditions to improve and risk leaving his people stranded in hostile territory. What he couldn't do was admit that the person best qualified to navigate those conditions was sitting 20 feet away, officially assigned to logistics support and personally invested in proving that her warnings had been prophetic rather than paranoid. The radio remained silent. The fog pressed against the windows like a living thing, reducing the outside world to a gray void that seemed to swallow light and sound with equal indifference. Somewhere in that darkness, trained professionals were learning the difference between confidence and competence, between assumption and reality. Jessica closed her laptop and stood, her movements careful and deliberate. She had preparations to complete, equipment to verify, and a conscience to live with regardless of what the next few hours might bring. The system had failed Razor 6 through arrogance and pride. She wouldn't compound that failure through inaction when she possessed the skills and knowledge to make a difference. The fog would lift eventually. When it did, someone would need to be ready to fly into whatever remained of the mission that should never have been launched. The hovercraft bay felt like a cathedral in the pre-dawn darkness, vast and echoing and filled with the kind of silence that preceded either prayer or disaster. Jessica moved through her final preparations with the systematic precision of a surgeon, each action deliberate and verified before moving to the next. Her hands were steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system, muscle memory guiding her through procedures she'd practiced countless times, but never under circumstances like these. The radio in the operations center had been silent for over 2 hours. No additional transmissions from Razor 6, no updates on their condition or location, no miracle breakthrough that would render her unofficial rescue mission unnecessary. Miles had paced the center like a caged animal, alternating between frantic radio calls and heated discussions with his staff about options that all seemed to lead nowhere. Jessica had listened to enough of the debate to understand the tactical situation. The fog had grounded conventional aircraft, the rough seas had made boat-based rescue impossible, and the hostile forces in the area had made ground-based extraction unthinkable. Razor 6 was stranded in conditions that exceeded the operational parameters of every officially sanctioned rescue platform. Every platform except one. The hovercraft systems came online with satisfying efficiency, indicator light switching from red to amber to green as each component reported ready status. Jessica ran through her pre-flight checklist with the kind of thoroughness that came from knowing she'd have no backup if something went wrong. No support team to troubleshoot problems or provide emergency assistance. She strapped herself into the pilot's seat and adjusted the harness, ensuring that every buckle and connection was secure enough to handle the violent maneuvering she might need to perform. The inlet conditions would be brutal, cross-currents and standing waves that could flip an unprepared craft or slam it into the rocky shoreline with fatal force. Her navigation system displayed the route she'd plotted during the past 2 hours, A careful path that accounted for tidal flows and wind patterns while avoiding the worst of the turbulence she knew would be waiting. The official charts showed a straight line approach to the inlet, the kind of textbook navigation that worked well in calm conditions, but became suicide in the real world of chaotic water and unpredictable currents. Jessica's route was longer and more complex, following channels she'd identified through patient observation and careful measurement. It would take more time and consume more fuel, but it offered the best chance of reaching Razor 6's position without becoming another casualty in a rescue attempt gone wrong. She pulled on her helmet and activated the communication system, switching to the emergency frequency that Razor 6 had been using for their last transmissions. Static filled her earphones, but she thought she could detect something underneath. The electronic noise, voices maybe, or the sound of equipment being moved under difficult conditions. Razor 6, this is Rescue Bird. I'm inbound to your position. If you can hear this transmission, prepare for extraction in approximately 30 minutes. She didn't identify herself by name or call sign. Miles would be monitoring communications from the operations center, and she had no desire to give him advance warning of her unauthorized mission. Better to ask forgiveness than permission, especially when the permission would never come from people more concerned with protocol than with saving lives. The hovercraft lifted smoothly from its berth, rising on a cushion of pressurized air that allowed it to clear the bay doors and emerge into the gray dawn. The fog was even thicker than it had appeared from inside, reducing visibility to perhaps 50 meters and turning the familiar coastline into an alien landscape of half-seen shapes and uncertain distances. Jessica switched to instrument flight, relying on GPS coordinates and radar readings rather than visual references. The hovercraft's navigation system painted a picture of the world in green lines and numerical displays, showing depth contours and current flows with the precision that human eyes couldn't match in these conditions. The first part of the journey was smooth, following the protected waters inside the harbor, where the fog provided concealment without creating serious navigational hazards. Jessica pushed the craft to cruising speed, balancing the need for haste against the importance of arriving with enough fuel for the return trip and whatever maneuvering might be required during the rescue. As she approached the harbor mouth, the water conditions began to deteriorate. Swells rolled in from the open ocean, lifted by winds that had been building strength throughout the night. The hovercraft rode the waves with mechanical indifference, its flexible skirt allowing it to conform to the water's surface without losing lift or stability. Jessica's earphones crackled with another transmission, clearer this time, but still broken by static and interference. Double quotes, ... still taking fire, ... web is down bad ... need medical attention immediately. The voice was tight with pain and exhaustion, the kind of controlled desperation that came from professional soldiers pushed beyond their limits. Jessica keyed her microphone, hoping her transmission would penetrate the electromagnetic chaos better than theirs had. Razor 6, this is Rescue Bird. I have your approximate position and I'm closing on your location. Prepare for immediate extraction. Mark your position if possible. She didn't wait for a response. The inlet was just ahead, marked by the distinctive pattern of waves that indicated shallow water and complex currents. Jessica reduced power and began her approach, every sense focused on reading the water's mood and anticipating its next move. The inlet mouth was worse than she'd feared. What had been a challenging but navigable passage a week ago was now a maelstrom of conflicting currents and standing waves. Water funneled through the narrow gap with tremendous velocity, creating hydraulic features that could trap or destroy any craft caught in their grip. But Jessica had studied this inlet for months, had measured its moods and mapped its dangers with the kind of obsessive attention that others had dismissed as excessive caution. She knew where the deep water lay, knew which routes offered the best chance of safe passage, knew exactly how to time her approach to take advantage of momentary lulls in the chaos. The hovercraft bucked and twisted as it entered the turbulent water, its skirt flexing and adjusting to maintain contact with the roiling surface. Jessica fought the controls with precise inputs, never over-controlling but never allowing the craft to drift into the teeth of the worst hydraulics. Behind her, invisible in the fog, the base's operations center was probably erupting in controlled chaos as radar operators reported an unauthorized aircraft heading toward the crisis zone. Miles would be furious, would be demanding explanations, and threatening consequences that seemed meaningless compared to the lives hanging in the balance somewhere ahead in the gray. Jessica pushed the throttles forward and committed to the rescue that everyone said was impossible. Razor 6 was out there, wounded and entrapped by conditions that existed because their commander had been too proud to listen to warnings from someone he considered beneath his notice. Now she would prove that competence mattered more than authority, that preparation counted for more than arrogance, and that sometimes the most important missions were the ones nobody wanted you to fly. The shoreline materialized out of the fog like a half-remembered nightmare. All jagged rocks and violent water compressed into a hellscape that looked nothing like the sanitized satellite images from the morning briefing. Jessica cut the hovercrafts, engines to idle, and let momentum carry her toward the beach, using the craft's inherent stealth to approach Razor 6's position without announcing her presence to whoever had been shooting at them. The beach was narrow and rocky, backed by low dunes that offered some concealment but little real protection. She could see disturbed sand where the team's own hovercraft had made its landing, and darker stains that could have been fuel or blood, or both. Debris scattered across the tide line told the story of a mission that had gone sideways almost from the moment it began. Jessica beached her craft and secured it with practiced efficiency, driving anchor stakes into the sand and running safety lines that would prevent the hovercraft from drifting away if the tide shifted while she was inland. She checked her sidearm, verified her medical kit, and shouldered the portable stretcher that would be essential if Razor 6 had casualties too severe to walk. The sound of gunfire came from beyond the first line of dunes, sporadic and desperate, rather than the controlled volleys of a firefight between equally matched forces. Someone was pinned down and running low on ammunition, making each shot count while hoping for rescue that might never arrive through official channels. Jessica moved inland through the loose sand, following a trail of boot prints and equipment discards that led toward the sound of combat. Her training kicked in automatically. Low profile, careful movement, constant awareness of sight lines and potential cover. She'd learned these skills in military schools that had grudgingly admitted women but never quite accepted them as equals, where instructors had pushed her harder than the men while expecting her to fail more spectacularly. She crested the first dune and saw them. Razor 6 had taken position in a natural depression between two rocky outcroppings, using their gear and whatever natural cover they could find to create a defensive perimeter. 3 men were still mobile and returning fire, while 2 others lay motionless in positions that suggested serious wounds or worse. Team leader Marcus Webb was propped against a boulder, his left leg extended at an unnatural angle and his uniform dark with blood that kept spreading despite the field dressing someone had applied. Jessica keyed her radio and spoke quietly into her headset. "Razor 6, this is your ride home. I'm coming down the slope behind you. Don't shoot the person trying to save your lives." Webb's head turned sharply, his pain-glazed eyes struggling to focus on the figure moving down the sandy slope toward their position. "Who the hell are you?" "Jessica Martinez, coastal insertion specialist. The one who warned you this inlet was turning into a death trap." Recognition flickered across Webb's face, followed by something that might have been embarrassment or gratitude or both. "Martinez, Jesus, how did you get here? Hovercraft. Same way you did, except I actually read the tide charts first. Jessica dropped into their perimeter and immediately began assessing casualties with the clinical efficiency of someone who'd trained for exactly this scenario. How many wounded? How many mobile? 2 Kia, 3 walking wounded. Me with a busted leg that's not walking anywhere. Webb's voice was tight with pain, but steady with professional discipline. Enemy force is maybe a dozen hostiles with small arms positioned in the rocks about 200 meters north. They've got us pinned, but they're not advancing. Jessica nodded, already formulating evacuation priorities. The 2 motionless figures would have to wait. The living took precedence, and she had limited space in her hovercraft for casualties who couldn't contribute to their own rescue. It was a brutal calculation, but a necessary one. "Can you move if we get you stabilized?" she asked Webb while examining his leg wound. The break was compound, but not immediately life-threatening if they could control the bleeding and prevent shock. "I can move anywhere you can carry me," Webb replied through gritted teeth. "Just tell me you've got a way out of here that doesn't involve swimming through that inlet. I've got charts you people should have read and a route that'll get us home if you can hold together for 30 minutes. Jessica began unpacking her medical kit, pulling out pressure bandages and pain medication. "But first, we need to stabilize your leg and get everyone mobile." Gunfire erupted from the north, muzzle flashes winking in the fog like deadly fireflies. The remaining mobile members of Razor 6 returned fire with disciplined bursts, making their ammunition count while keeping the enemy at a respectful distance. Jessica worked through the noise with the focused concentration of someone who'd learned to compartmentalize chaos. She splinted Webb's leg with materials from her medical kit and gear salvaged from their equipment, creating a rigid support that would allow him to be moved without causing additional damage. The other wounded men needed field dressings and pain management, quick fixes that would get them functional enough to contribute to their own evacuation. "Listen up," Jessica said as she finished her medical work. "My hovercraft is beached about 400 meters south of here. We're going to move as a group, with the walking wounded supporting the stretcher cases. I need 2 men to carry Webb. 1 to lay down covering fire, and everyone else to grab essential gear only." One of the SEALs, a young operator with a blood-stained bandage around his arm, looked skeptical. "Ma'am, no disrespect, but extraction through that inlet is suicide. The current alone will tear any boat apart." "Good thing I'm not driving a boat," Jessica replied with a confidence she hoped was contagious. "I'm driving a hovercraft, and I've been studying these conditions for weeks while your command staff was ignoring my reports. Trust me, or stay here and wait for the Marines to show up sometime next week." The humor was dark but effective. The wounded men exchanged glances that spoke of shared experience and mutual trust, the kind of wordless communication that developed between people who'd faced death together. Webb made the decision for all of them. "We follow Martinez," he said, his voice carrying the authority of rank despite his compromised condition. "She's got us this far, and she's the only game in town." Jessica felt a moment of overwhelming responsibility settle across her shoulders like a physical weight. These men were trusting her with their lives based on expertise that had been dismissed and qualifications that had been questioned. Failure mean not just her own death, but the loss of trained professionals who'd been failed by their own command structure. She pushed the doubt aside and focused on the immediate tactical situation. The enemy fire had slackened somewhat, suggesting either ammunition constraints or a tactical repositioning that could work to their advantage. This might be their best opportunity to move before conditions deteriorated further. "Move out," Jessica ordered, surprised by the authority in her own voice. "Stay low, stay together, and remember that I'm the only person here who knows how to fly us home." The evacuation began with agonizing slowness. Wounded men helping other wounded men across terrain, that seemed designed to break bones and shred equipment. Jessica moved point, using her knowledge of the local topography to find the safest route through the dunes while keeping one eye on their back trail for signs of pursuit. Behind them, the enemy positions remained ominously quiet. Whether they were planning an ambush or simply content to let the inlet's treacherous conditions finish what their bullets had started, Jessica couldn't tell. All she knew was that every minute spent on land was another minute for things to go wrong in ways she couldn't predict or control. The hovercraft waited where she'd left it, secure and ready despite the deteriorating weather conditions. Jessica felt a moment of profound relief at seeing her machine intact and functional, followed immediately by renewed anxiety about whether it could actually carry 6 people through conditions that would challenge even an empty craft. "Get them strapped in," she ordered while beginning her pre-flight sequence. "Tight as you can make it. This is going to be rough." As the wounded SEALs secured themselves in the hovercraft's passenger compartment, Jessica ran through her startup checklist with the kind of meticulous attention that came from knowing she'd have no second chances. Systems that had been reliable in training exercises would now be tested under combat conditions, with lives hanging in the balance and margin for error reduced to 0. The inlet mouth beckoned like a gateway to either salvation or destruction, its churning waters promising a test that would prove whether preparation could triumph over impossible odds. The hovercraft lifted off the beach with a groan of protesting machinery, its fans straining against the additional weight of 6 passengers and their gear. Jessica felt the craft's handling change immediately, heavier, less responsive, with a tendency to wallow in the waves that would make navigating the inlet's violent currents exponentially more dangerous. Behind her, the wounded members of Razor 6 secured themselves with whatever straps and handholds they could find. Webb was strapped to an improvised stretcher, his face gray with pain but his eyes alert and focused. The other men checked their weapons and prepared for the possibility that this rescue attempt might become a running firefight. "How bad is it out there?" Webb asked through the intercom, his voice tight but steady. Jessica studied the water ahead, watching the patterns of foam and surge that marked the inlet's most dangerous features. "Bad enough that your original insertion should have been canceled. Good enough that we might actually make it if everything goes right. And if everything goes wrong, then we become a very expensive addition to the artificial reef program." The gallows humor drew weak chuckles from the passenger compartment, the kind of nervous laughter that helped combat veterans cope with situations beyond their control. Jessica appreciated the sound. It meant morale was holding despite their circumstances, that the men behind her still believed in the possibility of survival. The first swells hit the hovercraft like liquid hammers, lifting the nose and dropping it with jarring impacts that tested every bolt and weld in the craft's hull. Jessica fought the controls with precise inputs, never overcompensating but constantly adjusting to keep them on course toward the inlet mouth that promised either escape or destruction. A radio crackled with an incoming transmission, the voice sharp with authority and barely controlled rage. "Unauthorized aircraft, this is base operations. You are ordered to return to base immediately. Acknowledge this transmission and comply with direct orders." Miles. Jessica recognized the commander's voice even through the static and electronic interference. She could picture him in the operations center, purple with fury as he watched unauthorized blips on his radar screen, heading directly into conditions he declared impassable. She keyed her microphone and spoke with deliberate calm. "Base operations? This is emergency medical evacuation with multiple casualties aboard. Request priority clearance for immediate transit. Martinez, you are in direct violation of orders and operational protocols. Return to base immediately or face court-martial proceedings." Jessica almost laughed at the absurdity of it. "Here, She was risking her life to rescue personnel that Miles had endangered through his arrogance, and he was threatening her with legal consequences for not following procedures that had already failed catastrophically. Base operations, I have wounded personnel who need immediate medical attention. Unless you've figured out another way to extract them from this position, I suggest you clear the medical bay and prepare for incoming casualties. She switched off the radio before Miles could respond. Whatever consequences awaited her back, at base were problems for the future. Right now, her only concern was navigating the next 10 minutes without getting everyone killed. The inlet mouth loomed ahead like the throat of some vast sea monster, water funneling through the narrow gap with tremendous velocity and creating hydraulic features that could flip a hovercraft or smash it against the rocky walls. Jessica had studied these conditions for weeks, but seeing them up close while carrying a full load of wounded personnel was like the difference between reading about combat and actually being shot at. She lined up her approach with surgical precision, using GPS coordinates and visual landmarks to hit the exact spot where deep water offered the best chance of safe passage. The current would try to push them sideways into the rocks, while crosswinds would attempt to flip them over completely. Success would require perfect timing, flawless execution, and a considerable amount of luck. "Hold on," Jessica announced. Through the intercom, "We're going through." The hovercraft hit the inlet's turbulent water like a missile striking a liquid wall. Instantly, Jessica felt control slip away as competing currents grabbed the craft and tried to tear it in different directions. She fought the throttles and rudders with everything she had, using engine power and aerodynamic control to maintain their heading while the water around them turned into a chaos of foam and fury. A crosscurrent caught the starboard side and spun them halfway around, bringing them dangerously close to the rocky northern wall. Jessica reversed thrust and applied full rudder, using the hovercraft's maneuverability to claw their way back toward the center of the channel. Behind her, she could hear equipment sliding and men cursing as they were thrown against the bulkheads. "Still with me back there?" she called through the intercom. "Still breathing," Webb replied, though his voice sounded strained. "How much more of this?" 2 minutes to clear water. Maybe less if we're lucky. A standing wave caught them from below, lifting the hovercraft's nose until Jessica was staring at gray sky instead of churning water. For a terrifying moment, they balanced on the wave's crest like a surfer attempting an impossible trick. Then gravity reclaimed them, slamming the craft down into the trough with an impact that rattled every rivet and threatened to buckle the hull. Jessica's instruments flickered as the electrical system struggled with the punishment, then steadied as backup power systems engaged automatically. Warning lights flashed amber and red across her control panel, indicating stress levels that exceeded normal operational parameters, but hadn't yet reached catastrophic failure. They were almost through. Jessica could see calmer water ahead, the inlet's mouth opening into the relative safety of the protected harbor beyond. Just another few hundred meters of controlled violence, and they would be clear of the worst hydraulics. That's when the engine coughed. The port fan hiccuped for just a moment, its steady roar interrupted by a mechanical stutter that sent ice through Jessica's veins. In calm water, losing partial thrust would be manageable. In these conditions, with tons of water trying to crush them against the rocks, engine failure meant death for everyone aboard. She immediately began emergency procedures, switching to backup power and adjusting the fuel mixture to compensate for whatever malfunction was affecting the port engine. The fan smoothed out, resumed its steady operation, but Jessica knew they were now operating on borrowed time. "Come on," she whispered to the hovercraft, her hands gentle on controls that connected her to every rivet and wire in the machine. "Just a little farther. Just get us home." The inlet released them like a predator, losing interest in prey that had proven too difficult to catch. Suddenly, they were in calmer water, the violent hydraulics giving way to normal swells that felt like a peaceful lake after what they'd just endured. Jessica allowed herself one moment of relief before beginning the final run toward base. Behind them, the inlet continued its deadly dance, waiting for the next group of overconfident warriors who thought they could ignore the warnings of people they considered beneath their notice. Jessica had proven that competence mattered more than rank, that preparation could overcome prejudice, and that sometimes the most important missions were the ones nobody wanted you to fly. Now came the hard part. Dealing with the consequences of being right when everyone in authority had been catastrophically wrong. The base medical bay erupted into controlled chaos as the hovercraft settled onto its pad with a final wheeze from its abused engines. Emergency personnel swarmed the craft before the fans had fully spun down. Medics and corpsmen working with practiced efficiency to evacuate casualties who weren't supposed to exist according to the official mission parameters. Jessica remained in the pilot's seat as stretchers were loaded and wounded men were carried toward waiting ambulances. Her hand shook slightly now that the adrenaline was wearing off, the delayed stress reaction that came after surviving something that should have killed everyone involved. She'd done the impossible, but the cost was yet to be calculated. Marcus Webb was the last casualty to be evacuated, his stretcher pausing beside the hovercraft's cockpit long enough for him to grab Jessica's arm with a grip that was surprisingly strong for a man who'd lost significant blood. "Martinez," he said, his voice hoarse but determined. "What you did today ... There aren't words for it. You saved every one of us." Jessica nodded, unsure how to respond to gratitude from men who'd been trained to believe she wasn't qualified to save herself, much less them. "Just doing my job?" she managed. "No," Webb said firmly. "You did everyone else's job while they sat in meetings arguing about protocols. Don't let anyone minimize what happened here." "Don't let anyone minimize what happened here." He was carried away before she could respond, leaving Jessica alone in the cockpit of a hovercraft that looked like it had been through a blender. Warning lights continued to flash across her instrument panel, and she could smell the acrid scent of overheated electronics mixed with salt spray and hydraulic fluid. Commander Miles appeared at the base of the hovercraft before she could complete her shutdown procedures, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. 2 military police officers flanked him, their presence making clear that this conversation would be official rather than personal. "Step out of the aircraft, Martinez," Miles ordered, his voice carrying the kind of cold authority that preceded formal charges and career-ending consequences. Jessica climbed down from the cockpit, her legs unsteady after hours of fighting turbulent conditions. She faced Miles with the same composure she'd maintained throughout the rescue mission, refusing to show weakness even though she knew her career was probably over. "You are under arrest for disobeying direct orders, conducting unauthorized military operations, and endangering personnel through reckless action," Miles announced with obvious satisfaction. "You have the right to remain silent... Sir." The interruption came from behind Miles, spoken with enough authority to stop the commander mid-sentence. Colonel Patricia Hayes, the base's senior officer, approached with a stride that suggested urgent business and limited patience for bureaucratic theater. "Colonel," Miles said, his voice shifting to a more respectful tone while maintaining his underlying hostility, "I was just placing Martinez under arrest for her unauthorized actions during this morning's crisis." Hayes studied the scene with the analytical gaze of someone who'd spent decades navigating military politics and understanding the difference between following rules and accomplishing missions. Her eyes moved from Miles to Jessica to the hovercraft with its battle damage and emergency modifications. "Martinez," Hayes said, her voice neutral but not unsympathetic, "I need a complete debrief of today's events. Everything from your initial warnings about inlet conditions to your decision to launch an unauthorized rescue mission. Jessica straightened to attention, recognizing both an opportunity and a trap. Yes, ma'am. Where would you like me to begin? Begin with the intelligence you gathered about changing coastal conditions and how that intelligence was received by mission planners. For the next 20 minutes, Jessica provided a detailed account of her reconnaissance activities, her repeated warnings about deteriorating conditions, and the dismissive responses she'd received from command personnel. She spoke without emotion or accusation, simply stating facts and letting the timeline speak for itself. Hayes listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification about technical details or requesting specific documentation. Miles stood beside them with growing discomfort as Jessica's account made clear the chain of decisions that had led to the crisis. And your decision to launch an unauthorized rescue mission? Hayes asked finally. I had current intelligence indicating that standard extraction methods would be ineffective in existing conditions. I possessed unique qualifications for operating in those specific environmental parameters. And I had personnel in immediate danger who required assistance that wasn't coming through official channels. Personnel who were in danger because their insertion had been authorized despite your warnings about unsafe conditions. Jessica hesitated, understanding that her next words could determine not just her own fate, but potentially Miles's career as well. Military justice was often about scapegoats rather than truth, and she'd seen competent people destroyed for political convenience. But Webb's words echoed in her memory. Don't let anyone minimize what happened here. Yes, ma'am. The conditions I warned about were the direct cause of Razor 6's predicament. Hayes nodded slowly, then turned to Miles with an expression that could have frozen salt water. Commander, you authorized a mission insertion despite warnings from your coastal specialist about deteriorating conditions? The warnings were overly cautious, Miles replied, but his confidence was evaporating under the colonel's steady gaze. The mission parameters were within acceptable risk levels based on available intelligence. Intelligence that excluded current reconnaissance from your most qualified coastal operations specialist? Miles had no good answer for that question. Jessica watched him struggle with the mathematics of military politics, trying to find a formulation that would protect his reputation while acknowledging the obvious failure of his decision-making process. Colonel, Hayes said after the silence stretched long enough to make her point, I'm ordering a full investigation into the planning and execution of this mission. Martinez, you're restricted to base pending the completion of that investigation, but you're not under arrest. Commander Miles, you're relieved of operational authority pending review of your fitness for command. The words hit Miles like physical blows, each one stripping away authority and prestige he'd spent years accumulating. Jessica felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only the weary recognition that justice in military organizations often came too late to prevent the damage caused by incompetent leadership. 3 weeks later, Jessica sat in the same hovercraft bay where her story had begun, reading orders that would transfer her to a new assignment with the Naval Special Warfare Development Group. Her unauthorized rescue mission had been officially classified as exceptional performance under extraordinary circumstances, and her warnings about coastal conditions had been incorporated into updated operational protocols. Miles had been transferred to a desk job in logistics, his career effectively ended by his refusal to listen to expertise that challenged his assumptions. Razor 6 had recovered from their wounds and requested Jessica as their preferred insertion specialist for future coastal operations. The hovercraft beside her had been repaired and upgraded, its battle damage replaced with improved systems and enhanced capabilities. But Jessica still preferred to perform her own maintenance, still conducted her own reconnaissance, still prepared for missions that might never come, while others dismissed her warnings as excessive caution. Some things never changed. But some things, the important things, changed completely. Jessica Martinez was no longer the invisible specialist whose expertise was dismissed and whose warnings were ignored. She was the woman who'd flown into hell to bring heroes home, who'd proven that competence mattered more than politics, and who demonstrated that sometimes the most important missions were the ones nobody authorized. The fog rolled in again that evening, thick and cold off the Pacific, turning the base into a maze of half-seen shapes and muffled sounds. But Jessica wasn't worried about the weather anymore. She had current charts, verified intelligence, and the hard-earned respect of people who understood the difference between confidence and competence. And if another impossible mission presented itself, she would be ready. She always was. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.